imbecile.
A what?
An idiot.
I'm sorry. He said he wouldn't run away.
Shut up.
But,
Please!
but...
Just shut up! They're gonna fire me. Oh, you get to keep your job, but they'll fire me, and they've got every right to fire me, 'cause I'm the idiot who employed you. Oh, look. Guests. Are you a moron, partner? Huh? Well, you can't be any worse than us, because this idiot right here, just let the most notorious con man in the whole goddamn state walk clean out of a cell, clean out, and not a shot fired. Now, if you get him back for us, we'll happily pay you. How about that? Good. Good. Now, see, what I figure is he's headed on down to Pike's Basin, so you go down the canyon, and you get him, and I'm gonna beat this poor dumb bastard with a stick, and I'll try and join you on the other side. Come on.
Chapter 24.
Although he knew they wouldn't leave until the heat of the day was over, Newt felt so excited that he didn't miss sleep and could hardly eat. The captain had made it final. They were leaving that day. He had told all the hands that they ought to see to their equipment. Once they got on the trail, opportunities for repair work might be scarce. In fact, the advice only mattered to the better-equipped hands, Dish, Jasper, Soupy Jones, and Needle Nelson. The Spettle brothers, for example, had no equipment at all, unless you called one pistol with a broken hammer equipment. Newt had scarcely more. His saddle was an old one, and he had no slicker and only one blanket for a bedroll. The Irishman had nothing except what they had been loaned. P seemed to think the only important equipment was his Bowie knife, which he spent the whole day sharpening. Dietz merely got a needle and some pieces of rawhide and sewed a few rawhide patches on his old quilted pants. When they saw Mr. Augustus ride up with Lippy, some of the hands thought it might be a joke. But the captain at once put him in charge of the horses, an action that moved Dish Boquet to scorn. "Half the remuda will run off once they see him flop that lip," he said. Augustus was inspecting the feet of his main horse, a large buckskin he called Old Malaria. Not a graceful mount, but a reliable one. "It might surprise you, Dish," he said, "but Lippy was once a considerable hand. I wouldn't talk if I were you. You may end up with a hole in your stomach and have to play whorehouse piano for a living." "If I do, I'll starve," Dish said. "I've never had the opportunity of piano lessons." Once it was clear he was not going to be constantly affronted by the sight of Jake and Lorena, Dish's mood improved a little. Since they were traveling along the same route, an opportunity might yet arise to demonstrate that he was a better man than Jake Spoon. She might need to be saved from a flood or a grizzly bear. Grizzly bears were often the subject of discussion around the campfire at night. No one had ever seen one, but all agreed they were almost impossible to kill. Jasper Fant had taken to worrying about them constantly, if only as a change from worrying about drowning. Jasper's obsession with drowning had begun to impress them all. He had talked so much about it that Newt had come to feel it would be almost a miracle if someone didn't drown at every river. "Well, if we see one of them bears, Pete can stick him with that knife he keeps sharpening," Bert Borum said. "It ought to be sharp enough to kill a darn elephant by now." P took the criticism lightly. "Never hurts to be ready," he said, quoting an old saying of the captain's. Call himself spent the day on the mare, weeding out the weaker stock, both cattle and horses. He worked with Dietz. About noon, they were resting under a big mesquite tree. Dietz was watching a little Texas bull mount a cow not far away. The little bull hadn't come from Mexico. He had wandered in one morning, unbranded, and had immediately whipped 3 larger bulls that attempted to challenge him. He was not exactly rainbow-colored, but his hide was mottled to an unusual extent, part brown, part red, part white, and with a touch here and there of yellow and black. He looked a sight, but he was all bull. Much of the night he could be heard baying. The Irishmen had come to hate him since his baying drowned out their singing. In fact, none of the cowboys liked him. He would occasionally charge a horse if his temper was up, and was even worse about men on foot. Once, Needle Nelson had dismounted, meaning to idle away a minute or two, relieving himself, and the little bull had charged him so abruptly that Needle had had to hop back on his horse while still pissing. All the hands had a fine laugh at his expense. Needle had been so angered that he wanted to rope and cut the bull. Call intervened. Call thought the bull well made, though certainly a peculiar mix of colors, and wanted to keep it. "Let him be," he said. "We'll need some bulls in Montana." Augustus had been highly amused. "Good God, Call," he said. "You mean you want to fill this paradise we're going to with animals that look like that?" "He ain't bad looking if you don't count his color," Call said. "Be damned to his color and his disposition, too," Needle said. He knew he would be a long time living down having to mount his horse with his dingus flopping. "Well, I reckon it's time to go," Call said to Dietz. "We'll never get there if we don't start." Dietz was not so sure they would get there anyway, but he kept his doubts to himself. The captain usually managed to do what he meant to do. "I want you to be the scout," the captain said. "We got plenty of men to keep the stock moving. I want you to find us water and good bed ground every night." Dietz nodded modestly, but inside he felt proud. Being made scout was more of an honor than having your name on a sign. It was proof that the captain thought highly of his abilities. When they got back to the wagon, Augustus was oiling his guns. Lippy fanned himself with his bowler, and most of the other hands were just sitting around wishing it were cooler. "Have you counted the stock yet?" Call asked Augustus. The man possessed a rare skill when it came to counting animals. He could ride through a herd and count it, something Call had never been able to do. "No, I ain't got around to that task," Augustus said. "Maybe I will if you'll tell me what difference it makes."
Put it on the dead guy over there.
"It would be useful to know how many we're starting out with," Call said. "If we get there with 90%, we'll be lucky."
I swear.
"Yes, lucky if we get there with 90% of ourselves," Augustus said. "It's your show, Call. Myself, I'm just along to see the country." Dish Bogat had been dozing under the wagon. He sat up so abruptly that he bumped his head on the bottom of the wagon. He had had a terrible dream in which he had fallen off a cliff. The dream had started nice, with him riding along on the point of a herd of cattle. The cattle had become buffalo, and the buffalo had started running. Soon they began to pour over a cut bank of some kind. Dish saw it in plenty of time to stop his horse, but his horse wouldn't stop. And before he knew it, he went off the bank too. The ground was so far below he could barely see it. He fell, and to make matters worse, his horse turned over in the air, so that Dish was upside down and on the bottom. Just as he was about to be smashed, he woke up, lathered in sweat. "See what I mean?" Augustus said. "Dish has already cracked his noggin, and we ain't even left yet." Call got a plate of food and went off by himself to eat. It was something that he had always done, moved apart, so he could be alone to think things out a little. In the old days, when he first developed the habit, the men had not understood. Occasionally one would follow him, wanting to chat. But they soon learned better. Nothing made Call sink deeper into silence than for someone to come around and start yapping when he wanted to be by himself. Virtually all his life, he had been in the position of leading groups of men, yet the truth was he never liked groups. Men he admired for their abilities and actions most always brought themselves down in his estimation if he had to sit around and listen to them talk, or watch them drink, play cards, or run off after women. Listening to men talk usually made him feel more alone than if he were a mile away by himself under a tree. He had never really been able to take part in talk. The endless talk of cards and women made him feel more set apart, and even a little vain. If that was the best they could think of, then they were lucky they had him to lead them. It seemed immodest, but it was a thought that often came to him. And the more he stayed apart, the more his presence made the men nervous. "It's hard for normal men to relax around you, Call," Augustus told him once. "You ain't never been relaxed yourself, so you don't know what you're missing." "Pshaw," Call said. "He goes to sleep around me half the time. I guess that's relaxed."
Hey there. Let me go. So you got him?
"No, that's
Good.
worn out,"
Real
Augustus
good.
said.
Look, put him up
"If
on
you
my
didn't
horse
work him
there.
16 hours a day, he'd be as nervous as the rest." When
Nice
Call had
seeing you,
eaten, he
buddy.
took his plate back to Bolivar. He seemed to have decided to go alone.
Watching you
He had made no
die.
move to leave, at least. Call wanted him along, and yet somehow didn't feel quite right about it. It didn't seem proper that a man with a wife and daughters would go away without even informing them, on a journey from which he might never return. The old pistolero didn't know the Hat Creek outfit that kind of effort, and Call reluctantly raised the subject with him. "Bo, we're leaving today," he said. "You can have your wages if you'd rather." Bull just looked annoyed and shook his head, didn't say a word. "I'm glad you're with us, Bull," Augustus said. "You'll make a fine Canadian." "What is Canada?" Charlie Rainey asked. He had never been sure. "The land of the Northern Lights," Augustus said. The heat had caused a dearth of conversation and made him welcome almost any question. "What's them?" the boy wondered. "Well, they light up the sky. I don't know if you can see 'em from Montana." "I wonder if we'll ever see Jake again," P.I. said. "That Jake sure don't keep still." "He was just here yesterday. We don't need to marry him," Dish said, unable to conceal his irritation at the mere mention of the man. "Well, I've oiled my guns," Augustus said. "We might as well go and put the Cheyenne Nation to flight if the army hasn't." Call didn't answer. "Ain't you even sorry to leave this place now that we've made it so peaceful?" Augustus asked. "No," Call said. "We ought to have left right after we come." It was true. He had no affection for the border and a yearning for the plains, dangerous as they were. "It's a funny life," Augustus said. "All these cattle and 9/10 of the horses is stolen, and yet we once was respected lawmen. If we get to Montana, we'll have to go into politics. You'll wind up a governor if the darn place ever gets to be a state, and you'll spend all your time passing laws against cattle thieves." "I wish there was a law I could pass against you," Call said. "I don't know what wants is gonna do without us.